Welcome to today's webinar, Deconstructing Learning Standards. The materials needed for this webinar are a copy of a learning standard that you plan on using with your students, a copy of the PowerPoint, a copy of the Deconstructing Standards handout, your computer, and a pencil or a pen. Today's agenda. Our goal. Teachers will be able to deconstruct a standard to fit the needs of his or her students. Today, we will do the following. What is deconstructing a standard? Why deconstruct? How do I deconstruct? And deconstructing in action. So the question is, what is deconstructing a standard? And sometimes people call deconstructing a standard unpacking a standard, but it is pretty much the same thing. So essentially, deconstructing or unpacking a standard is the process of reviewing a standard and breaking it down skill by skill to its most simplest form. When you see standards as they are published, they're generally a high-level overview of what students should be able to accomplish, but they don't really break the skills down so that it's something that you can actually take and apply to your specific students. So even though you have a standard, it's still crucial that you deconstruct the standard so that it is tailored to your specific students. The next question, why deconstruct? Most importantly, deconstructing a standard helps to familiarize yourself with that particular standard. It's crucial that we understand everything that the standard is requiring the students to do so that we can put the best scaffolds in place. Next, it helps you to assign the appropriate standard to the appropriate project and the appropriate number of standards to the appropriate project. Sometimes we will try to assign 3 or 4 different standards to a particular project, but once you unpack it, you'll realize that one standard has 4 skills that need to be addressed within that project, and trying to address 4 standards is just something that will be impossible to do. Next, students have different skill sets. So every year our students vary. It's important that we understand what the standard is requiring students to do so that we can meet those particular skill sets. You have to make sure the correct skills are being scaffolded and best supports are in place so that students can experience success. So, how do I deconstruct a standard? I've come up with 6 steps to use to deconstruct any standard. First, you need to carefully read the standard. Next, in your own words, you need to restate what students will have to do. Third, you need to think of what an exemplar of the standard would look like. Number 4, note the skills highlighted in the standard. Number 5, using data, and this can be informal or formal data, gauge how much exposure your students have had to each skill. And number 6, list any skills or scaffolds students will need in order to accomplish the skills highlighted in that standard. Now it's time to watch Deconstructing in action. So for step 1, I have decided to use the Common Core Essay Standard, ELA Literacy Standard, Reading Literature. This is going to be a 9th, 10th grade standard. It's the very first one. So what I need to do is I need to first read this standard carefully so that I have just a broad understanding of what it means. So this standard requires that I cite strong and thorough textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text. So what I'm going to do is ask myself, what are my first impressions of this particular standard? After reading that standard, one of the things that I've realized is it requires several steps and skills in order to accomplish it. It is not something that's particularly straightforward. It's not something I think that my students will struggle with, but I just also know that there are several skills in this particular standard, and I need to make sure that my students understand all of those skills. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to take a few moments to review the standard that you've brought to this particular webinar. Take a moment to carefully read the standard and think about this question. What are your first impressions of this standard? Make a few notes about what your first impressions of the standard are. Now that you've had a few moments to review your standard, to just get a high-level overview of what the expectations are, we can move on into step number 2 of deconstructing, which is to, in your own words, restate what students will have to do. So, after reviewing my standard, I've determined that my students should be able to use evidence to support their inferences and plainly stated information from a text. That's essentially what this particular standard is asking my students to do. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to take a few moments to review your standard and then in your own words restate what the standard is requiring students to do. Now that I've come up with an example in my own words of what this particular standard is requiring, I need to move on to step number 3, which is thinking about what an exemplar of this standard would look like. Now, I think this particular step is particularly crucial because it helps you to really understand what a final product would look like when you're assessing this particular skill. So, after reviewing my particular standard, I've determined that an exemplar might be a literary analysis essay in which students make an argument about an inference drawn in a text and support it with evidence from that text. And I'm going to continue thinking about things that students would have to do so that I could actually assess whether or not students have met this standard. So I will probably look for a thesis statement with an inference that is clearly stated and supporting evidence that is clearly identified. And then I would also focus in on body paragraphs in an essay that use strong evidence to support the thesis. So what I would like you to do is to take a few moments to think about what an exemplar of your standard would look like. Now that you've done steps 1 through 3, you have a much better understanding of what your standard is asking of students and an understanding of what that would look like if you were grading it or assigning some sort of assignment or project using that particular standard. Now we can move on to step 4. So step 4 is note the skills highlighted in the standard. So referring back to the standard that I've used, I'm going to underline or circle or highlight, whichever thing that you prefer, the skills that are needed in order to actually meet that standard. So as I'm looking for skills, I'm going to particularly keep an eye out for things that are verbs or maybe the noun form of a verb, because generally those are the skills that students need in order to accomplish that particular task, or the skill that they need will be somewhere near that particular verb. So my students should be able to cite strong and thorough textual evidence to support analysis. So the first thing I'm going to look at is they should be able to cite textual evidence. That's one thing that they should be able to do. I've also noted that they need to support an analysis. So I'm going to underline analysis because that is also a skill that my students will need. As I continue reading, it says of what the text says explicitly as well as inferences drawn from the text. So I have underlined the word explicitly because I know that explicit details is something that students need support with, and making inferences is also a skill that students need support with. So I have underlined all of the things that are necessary in order for my students to actually understand the standard. So what you're going to do is you're going to look at your standard, the one that you selected for this particular webinar, and you are going to underline, circle, or highlight the skills that are needed in order to meet that particular standard. Now that I have clearly identified the skills that are needed in order for my students to understand the standard, I can move on to step 5. Step 5 is using data, and this can be informal or formal data, to gauge how much exposure my students have to each skill. So again, I need to highlight this. This can be informal or formal data. So this could be data that you've pulled from a summative assessment. This could be your district's assessment. This could be a diagnostic that you've given to students. This could be based on observation as you've watched your students work. This could be based on information that you've exchanged with colleagues at grade level or team meetings. But it's crucial that you're using data in order to determine how much exposure your students have to those particular skills. And so a very simple way to do it is to just list those skills out, and then you can put yes, no, or some. So let's say in this particular situation, my students can definitely cite textual evidence and analyze a text because I've required that of them in a previous project. However, I've noticed that students really cannot distinguish between an explicit detail and an inference because some of my students have been exposed to inference, but I'm pretty sure all of them have not been exposed to inference. So I've just gone through and done a quick overview of my students' exposure to those skills. So what you need to do is you need to review your skills that you've highlighted, and you need to determine if, yes, students have been exposed to this skill, or some of your students have been exposed to the skill, or marking no, your students have not been exposed to this skill at all. Now that you've identified the skills with which your students are comfortable and with which your students are not comfortable, you can move on to step number 6, which is listing any skills that students will need to do in order to accomplish the skills highlighted in that standard. So for my example, I realized that my students had not been exposed to inference. So I'm going to ask myself a few questions as I'm thinking about how will I support students with inference. So the first thing I thought about was trying to figure out what is an inference. So coming up with a clear definition of what that means and what that looks like. Then I moved on to roadblocks. It is crucial that you think about roadblocks. What roadblocks might my students have in understanding inference? So as I go through this, one thing that I remember is that students are in a space developmentally where they struggle with identifying inferences because they struggle with putting themselves in someone else's shoes. So it's difficult for them to use someone else's experiences to make an educated guess about what may or may not happen. Last, I'm going to ask myself, how can I support students' understanding of this particular skill? And so I'm thinking about, how do I teach inference? How do I get students to understand inference? And so generally, I have students identify their background knowledge about a specific topic. I have them identify things that they know about this topic based on the text. And then we make an inference based on that. So what I would like you to do is to identify the skill that you feel your students will need the most support with. And I want you to answer this question. What is this skill? What does this skill really mean? What is this skill really requiring my students to do? Then ask yourself, what roadblocks might my students have in understanding this particular skill? Finally, you need to ask yourself, how do I support my students with understanding this skill? Now, I need to highlight, sometimes once you identify the skill, everything is already done. And all you have to do is think about how you're going to teach that skill. But sometimes skills can be unpacked even further. So you need to determine if there are additional skills the students will need in order to actually understand the skill you've highlighted. Please use the next few moments to complete step number 6. In summary, deconstructing standards is simply breaking a standard down by skill. It helps you better understand the expectations of the standard, therefore supporting your scaffolding of that particular skill. Deconstructing can be done in a simple process that I've identified 6 steps for. The first is reading the standard. The second is restating the standard. The third is thinking of an exemplar. The fourth, highlighting needed skills. The fifth, gauging student skill exposure. And the sixth, listing additional skills and scaffolds that would be needed for students to understand the skill. Thank you for purchasing this particular webinar. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me via my website at www.shikahenley.com. Again, that is www.shikahenley.com. If you're interested in an additional week of access to this webinar and all of its contents, please be sure to complete the brief survey that I have included with this seminar. Again, if you're interested in an additional week's access to this particular webinar, please be sure to complete this survey that I have included with this webinar. Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate your time, and I hope that you found this particular webinar to be helpful.